Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. Today we are tackling Lamentations. Oh boy. Now, if you're a regular viewer of this program, then you may have noticed that of late we have strayed somewhat from my normal pattern of tackling one of the books of the Bible every couple of weeks. The last installment in that series was now 7 episodes ago. Now, partly this was because these take a lot of time to write and produce, a lot more than the eclectic material that I present the rest of the time, and I've just been insanely busy. But that's not a complete explanation, because the truth of the matter is that I'm pretty much always insanely busy, so what's so different about this time? Well, what's different is that I sat down to organize my thoughts and prepare for this look at Lamentations many times over, and always ended up stuck. But I think I finally cracked the nut, and I hope that you will agree. There's plenty for us to learn from Lamentations, including lessons that you can apply today and tomorrow and for the rest of your life on this earth. Like everything else in the Old Testament, Lamentations serves as a shadow of what God was planning all along through His Son. And reading the words penned by grieving exiles deprived of their home, their dignity, and their most visible connection to God can help us to understand Jesus better. So let's start with the title, Lamentations. A lamentation is a sad poem or a song that expresses grief and mourning over a loss or another source of great sorrow. But while that's very helpful, it's not actually the title of this book in Hebrew. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was produced in the few centuries leading up to the birth of Christ, it was called Lamentations, but aside from the books named for their authors or most prominent characters, in the Hebrew Bible, they're mostly named for the first word or the most prominent word in the first sentence of the book, in such a way as to neatly encapsulate what the Jews considered each book to be about. So what did they call this book? Eka, which means how. Chapter 1, verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people! How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. And so the title stands alone as a rather vivid introduction to the subject matter of this book, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and subjugation of its population to the Babylonian army that burned it to the ground. Let's back up to Deuteronomy to help us better understand what this meant to them. Just before the Israelites crossed the Jordan to conquer the Promised Land, God told them to drive out the current tenants, who were pagan polytheists who'd so degraded themselves and debased their own inherent God-given value through lawlessness, corruption, sexual confusion, and killing their own babies, that in many cases God's judgment was that the best answer was extermination. He also told Israel to destroy their idols and refuse to learn their ways, lest they go down that same road. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 3 through 6. You shall tear down their altars, and dash in pieces their pillars, and burn their asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods, and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put His name, and to make His habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings, and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. This vague notion of a certain, single, as yet unspecified location for their worship and service to God comes up over and over in Deuteronomy. It's discussed further in chapter 12, again in chapter 14, again in chapter 16, and it's also briefly mentioned again in chapter 18, and again in chapter 26. We don't read about a clear prescription during the ensuing history to say, that city, there, that's the one. But after King David set up his capital in Jerusalem and decided it was time to make a more permanent home for God's throne on earth, God gave him His blessing, sort of. He wanted David's son, Solomon, to be the one to actually build it, and David chose Jerusalem and made all the preparations for his son to take over and see that it was built. After it was built, at the dedication ceremony, we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. That seems like a pretty clear stamp of approval, but it gets better. Verse 11. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house. All that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord and in his own house he successfully accomplished. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locust to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open, and my ears attentive to the prayer that is made in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house, that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father, saying, You shall not lack a man to rule Israel. Let's zero in on a few of these details, shall we? God has chosen this place, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount specifically. So the prediction in Deuteronomy that we read a moment ago is now fulfilled 4.5 centuries later. Finally, it's done. This is going to be great. God also promises to hear the sincere prayers made in this place. Again, Jerusalem, the temple. That was in verse 15. How long was this supposed to last? The rest of Solomon's life? No, verse 16, forever. And, provided they remain true to God, he will keep his covenant with David, and one of his descendants will rule on the throne in Jerusalem. This is a promise that the city, the temple, and the Davidic monarchy are here to stay. That was around the year 957 BC. It had taken 450 years to realize this promise, and the time frame God has in mind is forever. So, how can it be that a scant 370 years later, the city has been leveled, the temple destroyed, and the king torn from his throne and carried captive to Babylon after watching his sons be executed by the Babylonians? Hence the Hebrew title. How? This will be the tone for the whole book, more or less. These 5 poems in Lamentations, because each chapter is its own poem, these 5 poems are part of the attempt to process what has happened. Let's go back to the text and read the first 7 verses of chapter 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Her foes have become the head. Her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. From the daughter of Zion all her majesty has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembers, in the day of her affliction and wandering, all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. This doesn't read much like our poems in English, but one of the common forms of poetry, especially in Hebrew, is the acrostic, and that's what these 5 poems and Lamentations are. Sort of. It gets weird. Take a look here at chapter 1. Yikes, that's tough to work with. But if we just look at the first lines, okay, that's easier. Now we've got the verse numbers included, which I usually leave out, but in this case they're kind of important. There are 22 verses, and each verse begins with the next letter of the alphabet. But of course we're not talking about the English alphabet here. Instead it's the Hebrew one, hence 22 verses corresponding with their 22 letters. So why do this? I think I can illustrate using an English expression, from A to Z. It's as if they're trying to understand what has happened and looking at it from every angle conceivable, leaving nothing out. It's a comprehensive look at the calamity and a comprehensive attempt to explain it to themselves. It looks to them like God hasn't kept the promises, and that strikes at the very core, the very foundation of all that they as a nation believe. It was existential. And so the poems of Lamentations are an attempt to process all of that, the grief, the shame, the pain, the confusion. Before chapter 1 ends, the poet is blaming? Maybe it's more fair to say attributing responsibility to God. Let's pick up in verse 11. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire, into my bones he made it descend. He spread a net for my feet, he turned me back, he has left me stunned, faint all the day long. So what does he do? Verse 16. For these things I weep. My eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob, that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. As he tries to answer the question, why, an answer suggests itself, and Jerusalem, personified as a woman here, admits that it's true. Pick up in verse 18. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city, while they sought food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, for I am in distress. My stomach churns, my heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In the street the sword bereaves. In the house it is like death. This is gut-wrenching. The city was full of sin, rebellion against God and his law, and spiritual adultery, which is to say, worshipping all sorts of idols instead of God alone, as well as corruption from the leaders who were supposed to know better and yet led the people astray. Chapter 2 continues that thought. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid in ruins its strongholds. And he has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. The Lord has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They raised a clamor in the house of the Lord, as on the day of festival. It was hard for them to imagine why God would allow his chosen people to be conquered, but even more, why he would allow his own house, his own altar, to be desecrated and ruined. Now they've realized it's not that he allowed it, it's that he did it himself. The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you, and exalted the might of your foes. Where did he command this long ago? Well, many times, but do you remember all those promises in 2 Chronicles 7 that seem to be unraveling with the fall of Jerusalem and the monarchy and the Jewish nation? Right after God told Solomon, "This is the place, and I'll hear the prayers offered from this temple, and I'll put my name there forever, and your descendants will retain the throne throughout the generations," he said, beginning in verse 19, "But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will pluck you up from my land that I have given you, and this house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And at this house which was exalted, everyone passing by will be astonished, and say, Why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore he has brought all this disaster on them. So that explains rather a lot. Lamentations chapter 2 is Jerusalem's realization that God told them what would happen if they disobeyed. They messed around anyway, and they found out. That brings us to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is much more alphabetical than the rest. In 1 and 2, only one line out of 6 actually had to start with any particular letter. Chapter 3 is the same length. It's still 66 couplets, but this time all 3 of the couplets in each set begin with whatever letter is next on the list. So it's a lot more rigid and more restrictive and more ordered and less free-flowing. It represents the culmination of the attempt to rationally process the events in question. Now, recognizing that A, God is the one who's behind this, B, it's our own fault for rebelling against him, and C, he even told us this would happen if we didn't shape up and we didn't listen, the mourner starts to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Let's just read a big chunk, starting in verse 13. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel, and he made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it, and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke of his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But, though he cause grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. It would be tempting to lash out at God, to call him unrighteous and uncaring, or what have you. The mourner, and through his pen, Jerusalem, has done a fair amount of venting already, but in this chapter, he remembers more of those promises and threats from God in his law. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. This comes just after the blessings for obedience are pronounced, then the curses for disobedience, including destruction and deportation. It's as if the mourner in Lamentations is grappling with what he has witnessed, and as he has tied together for the first time the curses that God pronounced on Israel for disobedience with what has happened, he then comes to the realization that those curses are followed in the law by hope. This is an opportunity, he suddenly realizes. It doesn't have to end this way. Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven, he says. He's sure that God will fix this then. And then he sits down to watch and wait. Chapter 4. This one is back to the slightly less organized acrostic, just one line per stanza following the alphabetical order. It's also back to a simpler recollection of what some of the nitty-gritty details of the city's fall looked like, with a focus on contrasting her past glory with today's filth and misery. Verses 1 and 2. How the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. The precious sons of Zion, worth their weight in fine gold, how they are regarded as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. Verse 4, the tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives to them. Verse 9, happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger, who wasted away, pierced by lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. That's not even all of it. This was unimaginably awful. And yet, the mourner tries to focus on his newfound hope. Verse 21. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk, and strip yourself bare. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer, but your iniquity, O daughter of Edom, he will punish. He will uncover your sins. It's as if he's saying, yes, we got what was coming to us, but at least it's over. And to our neighbors who laughed at us while we were in the throes of this destruction, we don't care anymore, because we know the same thing is going to happen to you soon, too. Finally, that brings us to chapter 5. This one is also 22 verses long, but the acrostic format has been oddly abandoned. The verses are also much shorter, so that this is the shortest chapter of the book by far. Let's just read it. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are weary. We are given no rest. We have given the hand to Egypt and to Assyria to get bread enough. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is none to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin is hot as an oven with the burning heat of famine. Women are raped in Zion, young women in the towns of Judah. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind at the mill, and boys stagger under loads of wood. The old men have left the city gate, the young men their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. For this our heart has become sick. For these things our eyes have grown dim. For Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us, and you remain exceedingly angry with us. It's nowhere near as hopeful as chapter 3 was, or even chapter 4 for that matter. It just sounds awful. After finding his hope in chapter 3, the poet sat down to wait. And wait. And wait. How long did it take before a meaningful sign of restoration? Decades. They learned their lesson, stopped worshiping idols, to an extent stopped engaging in their other sins, although some of that was through simple loss of opportunity, not force of will, and they expected everything to go back to normal. But it didn't. God had decreed a 70-year period of exile in Jeremiah 25. Their hope started to wear thin. They're back in chapter 5 to confusion, not over why God punished Jerusalem, but now why he hasn't yet restored them. Will he ever? The last few verses are... I struggle to describe them adequately. Let's reread them. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. unless you have utterly rejected us, and you remain exceedingly angry with us. Especially verse 22 there is crushing, as if the mourners are collectively hanging their heads and resigning themselves to living out their days in misery and exile, confused as to why God's not fulfilling his promise. But that's not where the story ends. God always keeps his promises. It just often takes longer than we expect for reasons that are entirely up to him. There are so many things for us to learn from Lamentations. I hope you've been catching them along the way, because we're short on time and I'm not going to be able to go through as much detail as I'd like. First, this method of processing our troubles is worth imitating. Pour out your troubles to God. He wants us to do this. The New Testament tells us over and over to keep praying and casting our cares on the Lord. Very often, doing this actually helps us to process and better understand our own problems. Next, this whole thing points forward to Christ. Our relationship with God and our eternal security were a shambles. Why? We did it. It was our sin. We deserve destruction. But there's a promise that inspires hope in us. Repent and turn back to God, and he will restore what was lost and broken. He does this through Christ, of course, and we can apply the allegory directly to him, too. In fact, John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Why would God allow his own earthly habitation to be desecrated? Oh, we did it. It was because of our sin. We brought this disaster on ourselves. And yet, there is reason for hope. Just as God eventually restored Israel and had his house rebuilt, he also eventually raised up his Son from the grave, rebuilding that fleshly temple. The victory is won. Sin and death are conquered. Rejoice! And yet, here we sit, still waiting for the full meaning of the promise to take effect. We are stuck living in a broken world, awaiting the return of that temple. So what do? Lose hope? Give in? Give up? No. Pray always and don't lose heart. Watch and wait. Are you prepared? You can reach us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org. We'd love to help you. We'd love to have you among the servants of Christ, watching and praying for his return. You can find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for afternoon worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.